All right, now recording. So, the object of today's lesson is to further explore databases and SQL. Last week, when we talked about SQL, we went over a few of the most basic commands, SQL commands, which you must use in order to do stuff with a database. One of the biggest differences between a database and a spreadsheet is the lack of an effective graphical user interface. Now, while it's true that we can get MyPHP to do graphical user interface stuff, we can view our tables, we can even edit them through PHP MyAdmin. It's kind of not the point. You can't really configure, well, you can, but it's a fool's errand to configure software to use a graphical user interface. So when software talks to software, it usually does so in the form of strings and data files. So, as we learn how to put together an SQL query string, we are also learning how to put together these query strings for use by PHP so that PHP can tell the database what to do. Does that make sense? So, so just to get things started, let's fire up XINF. Please get XINF open and running, and a code editor of your choice. Today, we not only need our classical Apache web server operational, but we also require the MySQL SQL server operational. So recall that because these two servers are both running on the same machine, they are at localhost with respect to each other, but this does not necessarily need to be the case. You can imagine very easily a scenario where the database server is a separate machine from the web server. In fact, when you get sufficiently large, you kind of abstract that distinction out so that you can have, Facebook will have many, many database servers and many, many web servers, right? Once you get to that kind of scale. But anyway, so let me just get at the notes, see where we left off. Is this your first class of the day, this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I'm grading assignment 2 this week, possibly tomorrow. So you should have the grades forthwith. So, just because it's been a week, I'm going to briefly summarize a couple of slides for you, just to remind ourselves what we were talking about. So, SQL structured query language, we are primarily performing 4 types of operations, which we call CRUD operations: create, read, update, destroy. The SQL commands which correspond to these are select, that's read, insert, that's create, update, that's U, and delete is D. Each one of these is the actual, that is the actual syntax which is used when creating the query. Now, in terms of in-class demonstrations, I believe we only got so far as insert and select. So I'd like to do a demo to show you how some of these other ones work. Okay? And maybe, just maybe, by the time I have made a quick little SQL database, some of the rest of the classes here. So, recall that come on, this is getting a bit ridiculous. Recall that the way to access the PHP MyAdmin SQL administration page is by clicking the admin button for SQL in XINF. Alternatively, you can also just type that URL in and you will get to the same place. Now, let's create a new database as a refresher. We click New, pick a name for it. I'm going to call this database Facts. There we go. Now, a database, again, is approximately equal to a spreadsheet in Microsoft Excel if you take into account, like if you think of a spreadsheet with no sheets, right? If you create a spreadsheet document but it doesn't have any sheets initialized, that's what we just did by creating the database file. Sheets in a spreadsheet context correspond to tables in a database context. So let's create a new table. Last time we did movies, so what should the subject of our table be today? Anybody?
Video games.
Video games? Yeah? Okay. All right, video games it is. Video games. There we go. 4 is probably fine. There we go. So let's have an identification number, a name, a rating, and a genre. Now I'm going to show you something a little bit interesting about your tables. Having an ID number associated with table entries is a very good idea. It's like you're telling the system to do a little bit of bookkeeping for you right from the beginning. However, if you notice, the last time we did this example, I was like, oh, I forget what entry we're on. Is this entry number 4? I'll just try 4, right? Identification numbers should be unique. That is the one thing that an ID number should be, is not repeated, right? And every single item should have one. So, SQL databases give us the ability to apply additional attributes to fields in our tables. Let's take a look at some. index. These are index constraints. There are two here that are, the thing about SQL and this interface is there's way more going on than you actually need to know. So, maybe just write down the ones I talked about because those are the ones that are important and you can basically ignore the rest of them. Because, we're not doing anything all that fancy with databases in this class. You may in your future careers do more fancy things with databases, but not here. So, let's take a look at the unique constraint. So, one of the very important features of databases is that they don't have to do what you tell them. When you interact with a database, every query that you send is seen as being atomic. That is, it executes all at once and nothing is allowed to interrupt it. And the system is permitted to reject SQL queries, right? The database system itself can take an SQL query you send and decide not to execute it, right? Now, this seems somewhat arbitrary, but when given the reasons that the database might reject your request, I think you'll see that it makes a lot of sense. The first and most important reason that the database might reject your request is that it is malformed. For example, it has a syntax error, right? So basically, if your SQL statement doesn't compile, right, it doesn't break the database. The database just fails to run, right? So the integrity of the data in the database is preserved, even if you send it the occasional junk query, right? That's a very good and important property. Another reason that it might reject a request is if it violates a rule that you set up. So, for example, if we set unique here, it'll ask to make space for additional data. If we set this to unique, the database will reject queries which attempt to assign an index which is already used, right? So, if I try to insert ID is equal to 6, and then however long in the future I try to assign ID equals 6 again, that second query will be thrown in the bin, it'll be kicked off into cyberspace. That is not a valid query, because I already have that value, and that has a uniqueness constraint. Does that make sense? Good. So, another important one is primary key. So, primary keys are, you can describe them as a combination of other attributes. There's one that I haven't talked about yet called required, but you can imagine what required is, right? It's like if you don't provide required information, then that query is rejected as well, right? So primary keys designate one field as being both unique and required, and it sets one field aside as being, this is like the name of the entry. Not necessarily the name of the video game, right? The name of the string or something like that. But with respect to the database itself, you're kind of identifying one field of the record as being this is the unique name for this record in the database, right? This is entry blank, and you fill in the value from ID, right? Like this is entry 2,472. This is entry 57, right? So that's what a primary key is. When you have an ID field in a table, you should set the primary attribute. Make sense? Good, good? Any questions so far? Yes?
What happens if you name the like ID the same as the like primary ID? Name.
How do you mean?
See like how you put in video games ID,
Yep.
and primary has its own like ID as well.
Oh, just click OK on that. It's doing, so basically in order to set up a uniqueness constraint, it needs another hidden field in like that you're not really like interacting with inside of the database. It's associating it with ID. It's not like,
Okay.
it's like it's doing internal database stuff, don't worry about it. Good question though. There's one other thing that I want to show you with respect to ID. So right now we have it set up so that if we send invalid ID numbers into this database, we will still, it will fail to execute the query, so the database, the integrity of the database is maintained, right? The data in the database is always good now, but it still means that we are required to find out what the maximum entry ID is, and then whenever we insert something, give it an ID one more than that, right? So think about the position of a web server, right? Let's say a web server wants to add, for example, a new set of login credentials, right? You want to register a new user, right? In order to register that new user, as things currently are, we first must read the database from the web server to find an ID to find what the maximum ID is, or to find a vacant one, so that we can supply that ID when we register the new user, right? That's a pain in the butt. It's an extra step, it's an extra communication. We want to avoid that if possible. And this is something that the database should be able to handle easily enough. All it is a +1 operation. There should be no need for the server to do that for the database, right? So, there is, right here, a little checkbox for auto-incrementing. AI, in this case, does not mean artificial intelligence. It means auto-increment. So for a variable which is set to auto-increment, there we go, or for a field which is set to auto-increment, whenever a new whenever a new entry is given, you just don't specify the ID because it's being handled. It will automatically assign ID numbers in ascending order as you add new entries to the database. So it keeps track of that bookkeeping for you, right? We want, in all cases, we want the computers to work for us, not us to work for the computers, right? So, good. Let's make name a variable character array rating. Let's make that an integer, and genre will be another variable character array. We need to specify how big these are. Let's say 64 characters and 64 characters. So it is also possible to set the default value for a field. You can see that we have three options: as defined, current timestamp, and null. Let's say, for example, that we want rating to default to 0 if it hasn't been provided, right? As defined, 0. This is not quite the same thing as null, even though in PHP and JavaScript that is the case. Make sense? For the others, we can have default values of null. So default values have an interesting interaction with required fields. If you've set a default value, then the field will never be empty. This defaults to null, I believe. Well, it depends on the implementation of SQL. But if I fail to provide a rating now, that rating will default to 0, right? Required, the required constraint, means that I am required to provide that information. So these kind of exist in an either-or relationship, right? You either expect the information not to be provided and provide a default value, or you say, no, you actually do have to specify this, right? So, for example, it probably doesn't make sense that a video game can exist without a name. So we should set the required attribute for name. Where is it here? Where'd it go? Well, now let's just leave it. There we go. So, creating our database, we now get our field view. You can add and remove fields from this screen, but we just went to a lot of effort to set that up, so let's just not. So, we have a table with no entries in it. So now, let us review insert operations by inserting some information into the table. There we go. That's a bit better. So, when you click the insert button, you get a very handy template for an insert operation. But this template forgets certain important things, like the fact that ID is auto-incrementing and therefore not required. So, when using templates, please be sure to modify them as appropriate for the table and the situation that you find yourself in. So, we don't need to specify ID. That is an auto-incrementing primary key. That means we also don't need to provide a value for it. In fact, we should probably delete all of these. So, let's see, video game. Let's say Super Mario Bros. Because of course. How would we rate Super Mario Brothers? On a scale from 1 to 10.
I give it a 9.
Solid showing for Super Mario Brothers. Objectively, it's quite a good game. Genre. Platformer. There we go. Is this a good level of zoom? You guys can read that. It's quite a shallow. I'm used to asking people that like 5 or 6 rows back, you know. This is quite a shallow room. So, I'll give you guys a moment to copy that down. So, one of the annoying things about PHP is that it expects a level of precision in syntax similar to a programming language. Now, most people would not consider what we are doing with SQL to be proper programming, right? This isn't a programming language in the way that we're using it. However, SQL queries can become quite complicated. They can have if statements and loops and all of the other features that you would expect in a regular programming language. I wouldn't expect anyone to program Doom in it, right? But it can be a proper programming language, but not the way we're using it. So, let us execute. There we go. 1 row inserted. If we take a look at browse, you can see we now have our entry. And you see that this is entry number 1. Let's add a few additional ones. So, what's a video game? Someone from the audience.
Call of Duty.
Say it loud, sir.
Call of Duty.
Call of Duty. Call of Duty. Like the first one? Okay. How would we rate it? 10. Genre. FPS, first person shooter. Now, a fun thing about this page where you can enter SQL queries, so long as you put a semicolon at the end of the statement, you can actually put several SQL queries in this pane and execute them all at once, which saves you the trouble of having to re-click insert every single time. Right, so, how about another one? What's another video game? Super Mario and Call of Duty are the only video games.
We can do Fortnite.
Did you say Fortnite? Yeah, okay. Fortnite. I know that's not how they spell it, but they spell it wrong. How would we rate Fortnite? Hmm? 7?
Yeah, I'd be around 7.
7, okay. Genre, oh man, Battle Royale. Yeah. For some reason I wanted to call it a Coliseum shooter, which I knew was wrong. Alright, so now, I'd like to do a few which are kind of missing some fields and see how it handles it. So let's have a mysterious game with no name. Rating 2. Genre, graphic novel. So, but that's actually not, sorry, that's not actually leaving the information out. In order to leave the information out, you have to remove the name of the field that you're leaving out, and then just not provide information for it. let's create a game with no rating. Block. There we go. Genre is platformer. There we go. And let's leave off the genre on this one. Space carrier. And we'll give space carrier I think it's a 6. There you go. And then, just for fun, I have no mouth, but I must scream. Which I'd say is probably an 8. And it is an old school adventure game. Like a point and click. All right. I think it's get. I must scream. Executing it. I have no mouth yet I must scream is becoming increasingly relevant in the modern context because it's about a hyper-intelligent AI which takes over the entire planet, creates a post-apocalypse, and basically becomes a god that spends its time torturing the remaining humans. For no other reason than vindictiveness. So let's take a look and see how our entries that we left information out of them, how were they handled? Well, entry number 4, we can see name is null. Entry number 6, we can see genre is null. And entry number 5, you can see rating has been set to 0. Make sense? Any questions? Yes?
I got an error message.
Okay. So the reason you're getting that error message is because you are providing more values than you're calling for. So if you space, that will work.
I got an error message and I ignored it, and then I came back on
Ooh. Gross. Yeah, there's no history, eh? The other thing that
also, there's a lot of errors in my, in the
oh, unstable status.
No, I actually got it back.
Oh, you did?
It said get also saved community.
Oh, nice. Ah, cool.
But like, how do I fix the error now?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
That was an error leading to another error. So let's see. So in your case, it's complaining because you're saying you're providing 4 fields. You're providing at most 3. So you have to delete the names that are corresponding to the things you didn't provide. Very good. Well, I hope nobody wants to do an assignment on this stuff after this, of the people who aren't here anyways. It's okay, I'm recording it. So, now that we have some data, we can explore a little bit deeper how to perform a select query. So, the most basic select queries, well, the most basic one is given here, although this is slightly more than you actually need. So, select star from video games. If we execute this query, we get the entire contents of the table of video games. So what star means, it's a wildcard character that stands for all fields, right? So, if we wanted, for example, to see only name and genre, we could select name, comma, genre from table video games. One thing to note about SQL commands, language keywords are typically capitalized, but this is not required. It's not required of the syntax that these keywords be capitalized. It works just as well if they are lowercase. Select name, genre from video games. However, when it's kind of conventional to do them in all caps, and when I do it on the board, I'm going to continue to use all caps because it distinguishes for you which words are doing things and which words are like the key words of the language, right? Like, what are the words that we are inserting? It will be everything that's not capitalized. So, if we execute this query, you can see that we get name and genre exclusively. Make sense? Any questions? Good. So now, let's get a little more interesting. So, when we are pulling information from the database, it is only in very rare cases that we will want to pull literally everything in the database, right? Very often we will be concerned with specific or particular entries. SQL provides a mechanism for performing this type of database query, and that mechanism greatly resembles if statements. Specifically, the expressions that you put inside of if statements in order to control which branch you're executing. So, for example, I can say select star from video games where rating is greater than 8, or even greater than or equal to 8. Go. And there you have all of the entries with a rating greater than or equal to 8. You can imagine if I had, if these were posts in a social media platform, each one would have an associated timestamp. I could very easily, using this, select all entries that were made in the last 24 hours, for example. Right? Another example, we can do string matching as well, where genre is equal to platformer. And there you have it. By the way, in SQL, similarly to in JavaScript, single quotes and double quotes don't really matter. Single quotes versus double quotes does matter in PHP, but probably not to any great extent for how we're covering things in this course. Does that make sense? We can also combine these together. So, for example, select star from video games where rating is greater than 4 and rating is less than 7. And perhaps we'll say greater than or equal to, less than or equal to.
You have to put semicolons, right?
Seems the connection to the server has been lost. Oh. Let me try that again. Yeah, that worked. I don't know what it's talking about. Sorry, you have a question.
I didn't have one. I didn't have one.
Okay. So, it's a little bit different from C#. In C# we use double ampersands to indicate Boolean logical conjunction, Boolean and. Here we are using the actual words and, or, not, etc. Does that make sense? Any questions about this? Good. Good. So this is a very important mechanism. Where is a very important mechanism. A thing which is generally true of databases, there's no undo. So if you change, modify, delete entries, and you're not being sufficiently careful, you can end up destroying your data. So right now, I'm going to show you how to back up the data inside of one of these tables so that we can then destroy it. So, it's very simple. We have export and import tabs along the top. Actually, yeah, that's fine. Exporting rows from video games table. If you click go, it will ask you what name to give it. Folder 2025-03-03, the 3rd of March. Beware the Ides of March. And we get videogames.sql. Here's an interesting thing though. If we take a look at the contents of this file, it's not simply just a data dump of all of the data in, it's not like you're just exporting all of the data to a CSV file. What this actually contains is all of the steps necessary, all of the SQL code necessary to recreate the table from scratch. So this file will work and fix the table, put the table back in, even if the table is completely destroyed. Make sense? Backing up your data is a good idea. Again, the system is not going to do it for you. All right? So, import that same file or any other SQL file using the import file dialog. It's, about the same as you would expect. Nothing really to see here. I'm sure you've all done file imports through web interfaces before. In fact, I think you had to do that to upload your assignments, didn't you? So, probably enough said. Suffice to say, if you specify an SQL file here, it will take that file, read all the actual SQL, and execute it on the database automatically, thereby reconstruct the table. Or the whole database, if you want. So, good. Now, so we've talked about C, and we've talked about D. So we've done C, we've done R. Next in CRUD is U, which is update. So let's imagine that we want to fix the empty spots in our table. This one will have to be pared down significantly. So the keywords here: update, table name, set, and then we take the field names and assign to them the values we wish to modify. Now, in this case, it's useful to have your actual table open in sort of a side-on-side view so that we can see what we're doing. So, let's address entry number 4 first. Name is missing. So, can anybody give me a name of a graphic novel which you would give a rating of 2 to? I don't know, does anybody here play graphic novels? I personally don't. Let's imagine something sufficiently stereotypical. Sea urchin dating sim. There you go. Because they're all dating simulators, graphic novels, right? Basically every single one of them. That's my understanding of the genre. There we go. Oh man. So I was looking through Steam over the weekend or last week or something, and they're having like this new games fest, which is like unexposed games, right? Or games with low exposure. And there was one that was called Roguelite Deck Builder. And I didn't get the video because it was like a picture of a bunch of wood panels and a guy with a hammer. It's like literally deck building, like building a deck, like on the back of a house. It was hilarious, but I didn't buy the game. So there we go. So there we go. Update video games. Set name equal to Sea Urchin Dating Simulator. Oh, sorry?
Do you have to specify the block with the safe word, like common word?
Well, let's see what happens if you don't. Let's browse, shall we? Uh-oh. So, you're absolutely right. The thing that we failed to do was to say which entry we are updating, which entry or entries. So the default behavior of update is to update everything. And that can be really quite destructive. If I didn't have a backup, this would be a problem, right? Imagine doing this to, 3 3,000, 4,000 patient records, right? And like, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, well, surely a major organization who, a major organization that has, money and can employ intelligent people, surely they would have the systems in place to never ever suffer that kind of catastrophic data loss. It doesn't matter how good your system is, it can always be broken by an incompetent operator, right? So, let's restore, shall we? Import our chosen file. Go! So it's not going to do it because the table already exists. All right, this means I get to show you how to kill the table. So, this is among the most powerful commands at your disposal. Drop table video games. You notice how, like, with insert commands, it was like it just did it? Here it's like, are you sure? Do you really want to do that? Yes, I want to do that. It's okay, I made a backup. There you go. So drop table video games. Table facts.videogames doesn't exist. You have to go back, all the way back, to the database itself, which now has no tables. Yay! So drop table is like it's the nuclear option. It destroys the table completely and in its entirety, no undos. But this also clears up space to recreate the table. What? Oh, maybe I clicked it twice. Did I click it twice? Why are you hanging? Don't do this to me! I was just getting started, I was on a roll, no! Page unresponsive. You don't say. I'm just going to stop the server and restart it. What did I do? There we go. There we go. I must have clicked the button twice. Because there is the data. There we go. The data's back! Yay! So, the question you may ask yourself is, how does one protect oneself from doing something so phenomenally stupid as to set the name of every one of your video games to Sea Urchin Dating Simulator? The answer is a where clause. I wouldn't be surprised if this existed, by the way. So, there are a couple of approaches we could take here. If we want to zero in on just that entry specifically, we could say where ID is equal to 4. Remember that our identification numbers are unique. There's no way that this will target anything except what we're looking at. Go! And you can see we have cleared the 4. We've cleared the null from 4 there we have it. So far so good? Question?
Can we select multiples?
Oh yeah. For example, let's target this one. Let's say set genre equal to, I don't know, Space Harrier is kind of just like a shmup. Shmup stands for shoot 'em up. So we could target by ID. We can also target by any other condition that we could put anywhere else. So for example, you could do like rating greater than or equal to 7, similar to what we did before, but you can also do where genre is equal to null. And now, come on. Did you work? Show me the money. No. That's a shame. Okay, give me 1 second. I know this is possible. Okay. They've got a slightly different way of doing it. Instead of using an equal sign, it's is null, which is somewhat annoying. All right. Thank you, W3 schools. Where genre is null. Testing with a select query. So an excellent thing to do before you commit to any possibly destructive data actions is to take the query that you are going to use for like update, run the guard through a select statement, make sure that you're targeting the data that you think you are. Right? Question?
My question was different. I was asking if we can target column 4 and 5 to update it at the same time.
Oh, so here's the issue with that one, right? Let's say you have entry 5 and entry 6, fields A, B, C, right? Let's say you want to modify this one and that one, but let's say that you want to keep this one and this one, right? This is somewhat similar to the situation we have here, because we want to modify this one and this one, right? But we want to leave that and that intact. So you could write an update. Update table. Set A equal to yes, B equal to no, where, let's say this is ID equals 5 or ID equals 6, right? something like that. The problem is, what you'll get is an overwriting of the data that you want as well, right? It will say, okay, this entry, I'm overwriting both of those. So it'll say, yes, no, and destroy these values. Yes, no, no. So, in order to prevent data loss, I really you should do separate queries in order to prevent data loss. Yeah. Like updating, you have of all of these operations, updating kind of requires the most finesse, you know? Like deleting, you're deleting entire entries, entire records, so you don't need this level of finesse. But with updating, like you really are doing, it's like surgical precision strikes into the table. So update, set genre equal to, what was even the data? Space area, yes. Genre is equal to shoot up, where genre is null. There we go. Go. One row affected. And you can see the table has been repaired. Does this make sense? Yeah. Any questions about that? I'll leave entry number 5 just because I think we've done this to death. I think we've learned everything that's useful from this. So, finally, let's discuss the delete operation. So, delete is obviously the most, well, I'm not even sure I would actually say that. I was about to say delete is the most destructive, which is true in terms of it just gets rid of data. But with a bad update query, you can perform that query and not realize that you've destroyed the table. With delete, it's always obvious that you've destroyed the data or the table, right? So, delete operations are simpler. We are simply deleting entire table entries. Again, using the where clause to select which entries we are deleting. So, for example, if we wanted to delete all video games where rating is less than or equal to 3, do I really want to do that? Yes, I want to do that. And there you have it. We've deleted all entries with a rating less than 3. So now our table only contains good games. Does that make sense? Any questions? All right. Good. All right. So let's take a peruse through the slides, and if I missed anything, we'll go over that. So, SQL select. Yes, I think we did all of that. Insert into, we did all of that. Yes, that's just the syntax. Yes, that's good. Yes, that's Yes, good. So, the this is mainly about PHP MyAdmin. So there are other, so as I said previously, this is not the only SQL engine out there. If you find you need a database, but you don't want to go to the trouble and expense of setting up a web server, there's another one called SQLite. It basically does the same thing, but it's like just a program that runs on your computer, similarly to many other programs that run on your computer. So it's not designed to go out on the internet. It doesn't deal with SQL packets. When you download the program, install it, and run it, you are basically just given a command prompt, and then you enter your SQL queries and it executes them. Disadvantage, it's not for the internet. Advantage, easily hooks into programming languages like Python and C#. Python in particular has SQL-like integration reasonably straightforward. Well, it's a little clunky, but, perfectly serviceable. But, basically all databases are a little clunky, so. Good. Any questions? Good. Yeah. So, all right. So now we have a good idea, decent idea, even a middlingly good idea about SQL is a good idea about SQL. It is not the case that we can simply sort of break into our PHP MyAdmin and modify the database directly every time a user does something, right? That's ridiculous. It's simply not, even in the 80s they didn't do things that way, right? That is never what data entry clerks have done, right? So basically, the problem now falls to us to produce some mechanism by which PHP can be integrated with databases. So the problem, well, before we get into that, let's just take a moment to examine why PHP. Why wouldn't we do this with the client? Anybody have any ideas why we wouldn't want to do this with the client? Why do we need the server for this? Why can't JavaScript talk to the database directly? Any ideas? Have you ever heard me say, never trust the client? Never trust the client? Yeah. So, your database is vulnerable to attack in the same way that your website is vulnerable to attack. It's a bad thing to have someone execute their own JavaScript on your web page. It is a much, much worse thing to have an attacker able to send queries directly to your database. Anything on the client is fully accessible and modifiable by the user. And user can mean attacker. Databases are password protected. You need valid credentials in order to log into a database. In the same way that the advice is always never share your password with your friends or, family or girlfriend / boyfriend or anybody like that. Your password is your password. In the same way, never share your database password with a client. It's the height of foolishness, right? You're basically broadcasting to the internet if you do that. Hey, here's this database that I set up that I absolutely don't care about the contents of because I have left it wide open. It's like, it's like taking a bunch of gold bars, right, and putting them inside of a clear glass box in the middle of a major city and just having a door on the top where people can reach in and take the gold bars. That's the equivalent, right? So we must do this with PHP because we can verify our own server code, right? Our server code has to originate with us. And so long as we are very careful about filtering inputs from users, we can get away with not having, where's that sentence going? If we're careful about filtering inputs from users, then we know that there are no attacks going to the server and our data is not being compromised. Make sense? I'm pretty sure I've talked about major attacks before, but it really is true that when you're working with databases, these are the highest value attack items. A couple of major instances of SQL injection attacks, kind of like the normal thing you go after is credit card information, but you guys remember it was a number of years ago now, but there was this hack with PlayStation and a whole bunch of hundreds of thousands of PlayStation accounts were compromised. You guys remember that? No? Might have been before your time. Anyway, it happened, and it was due to an SQL injection attack. Another one, you guys know the website 23andMe? So this is personally I find the premise a little bit ridiculous that why would anybody do this, but here you go. 23andMe is a website where you spit into a cup and you mail that cup to people and they sequence your DNA and tell you who you're related to. I guess, you could see that you're marginally, I guess in theory for medical purposes it's useful to know that you could, you have a higher risk of, various types of cancers or whatever. And have that be a genetic test instead of relying exclusively on your memory of, what did great grandma Irma die of? I forget, Plus, there's lots and lots of types of cancer you could be vulnerable to that nobody in your family has actually died of. So, family history is not as useful as actual gene sequencing and determining these things, right? That being said, this is a bunch of people paying for a service that, like, the Ontario medical system would have done for them for free if they demonstrated just a little bit of, like, reason to need to have it, right? So it goes. You know, I sometimes joke, you know, I probably have enough German blood, I don't need to know who I'm related to, you know? But, and that has absolutely nothing to do with my marking policy. But, they got compromised, right? SQL injection attack on 23andMe resulted in a whole lot of people's genomes ending up on the dark web, being sold off to the highest bidder. Now, I can't think for the life of me why you would need, like, everyone's genomes. You know, why would you pay for that? Like, why is that information useful? You know, but like, I guess, you know, blackmail. I don't know if you can blackmail someone over their DNA, but like, I don't know. It kind of passes into like Bond villain territory for me. You know, like, why would you need to know? Like, how is that information useful to you? Well, I'm building a new civilization on the planet Jupiter, and I must make sure that we have highest levels of genetic purity because I am a Bond villain. I'm stroking a cat. I don't know. But yeah, SQL injection attacks are like, they cause the most data loss, they cause the most financial loss to companies, they are the biggest deal, right? Database breaching is the biggest deal. So when I say things about how to protect your database from being breached in PHP, you're going to lose marks if you don't do it the way I tell you to, basically. Because to do it any other way is to leave yourself open to vulnerabilities and, like, you know, I don't know how many of you are, like, eventually going to end up in the Hamilton Health Sciences system. Probably, you know, Hamilton Health Sciences, Halton, one of the you know, healthcare systems around the area, or maybe a little further. But you know, Hamilton at least has had enough problems with data breaches and that sort of thing in recent history, and I don't want any of you to be the reason that happens again. All right. So when you submit your assignments and they are dealing with databases, you need to use current standard practices, which are in this course. If you're looking up internet tutorials, you are not necessarily getting current standard practice, right? For security, this course is your primary resource, okay? I think that's reasonable. It's reasonable for me to try to prevent you from destroying your future employers.
Sir,
Yes?
can you just go over how we do that, or are you about to do that?
I was about to do that, yeah. Yeah, we actually, we're just about, so the first bit of class, we went over the SQL queries, right? And now we're going to learn how to execute SQL queries from within PHP so that the server can talk to the database. Because we don't want to talk to the database directly using JavaScript, because then any old user could do the same thing, breach the database, then you've lost everything. The only thing worse than losing access to your data, or the only thing worse than having your database breached is losing, like, root login access to the server itself. That's the only thing worse. If that happens, you really should just unplug the machine, find a big hole in the ground, throw the computer into the hole, find a number of large rocks, pile those on top of the computer, and then go buy a new computer. That's what you should do. So, part of the problem with PHP is that it continues to, for legacy and back support purposes, it continues to support, or it continues to implement a number of approaches to using databases that are out of date and no longer, not the current way of doing things and not best security practice. The best security practice uses a thing called the PDO, which is the PHP data object. You can see how much PHP likes acronyms where the P stands for PHP, huh? So, PDO, PHP data object. This allows us to connect to, send queries to, and read information from databases. Okay? So, this is the code for connecting to a database. I am not expecting anybody to memorize this code. I am expecting you to copy it down somewhere and use it, modifying the details that need to be modified where appropriate. All right? So, let's go through it. You guys remember we did try catches right at the end of C# last semester? Well, they're back. Connecting to the database will raise an exception, throw an exception, if the connection fails. The catch statement will execute in that case. It will say connection failed and print the message. So let's use our brains for a moment. What are some reasons a connection to a database might fail? Wrong password. That's a very good one. Wrong password would cause the connection to fail, absolutely. Anything else?
No internet.
No internet. Yes, there's some kind of problem with the connectivity itself. Your database can't be connected to. Absolutely. Anything else? Anything else anyone can think of?
Maybe like if you attempted more than, like you sent your username and password more than once and they were wrong, it would be locked.
Maybe. In order to lock the account, you have to at least provide a good username, though. So, but that's a thing that you could do. The username, as well as the password, could be incorrect, right? If the user doesn't exist, you don't get a connection. Thank goodness. There's one other way. I'd like to call your attention to this field here. DB name is equal to DB. So, when you connect to an SQL server, you must specify which database you are accessing. Remember that an SQL server contains many databases, many individual databases. If we take a look here, you can see that the databases we have: facts, information schema, MySQL, performance schema, PHP MyAdmin, and test. These are all separate databases which we could access individually. Of course, in our case, we're most interested in the one that we produce, facts. So, in our case, database name would be facts. But if you're trying to access a database that doesn't exist, that is another reason that your connection may be refused. So it is useful to know in what manner was the connection refused, because that will help you to correct the problem. So, the way that this works, we create a variable to contain the PDO database connection. In this case, it's called con. I'm not trying to con you. Ha ha ha. We then create a new object in a very C-sharpish style, right? We have the new keyword. We then present the name of the class and provide a list of parameters. If this executes with no exceptions, we echo connection successful. Otherwise, we continue. PDO returns an object that represents a connection to the database. Like a file handle, it allows us to access the database, and it fails if it fails, it throws an exception that can't be caught. So, shall we see if we can connect to our database then? So, let's travel over to XINF, htdocs. Let's make a new folder for today. 2025-0. I can't believe it's March already. Feels like only yesterday I was playing Pokemon in the cafeteria at high school. So, truthfully, actually, that's not a thing I ever did. I saw people playing Pokemon, but I never partook myself because my parents didn't let me take video games to school. So, let's create a new PHP script. Call this script databases .php. There we go. Like all PHP scripts, the PHP part has to be within the PHP tags. Now, let's take a look at that code that we have. Here we go. Copy. Pasta. Of course, our indentation didn't come through, but it never does. So, there we go. So we'll do the easy ones first. We are connecting to a database which is being run through XINF. There is a default username and password that we must use to connect to this database. The username is a root, R-O-O-T, and the password is an empty string. We could provide these in line, but often it's useful to specify them at the top of the file. Username is equal to root. Password is equal to empty string. The database name, I'm also going to replace with a variable. And I'm going to define that variable at the top of the file. Database is equal to facts. There we go. Now, we have this tricky thing. This is where we specify the host name. The host that we will be connecting to is localhost. But let me just see if he's got an example of that in the slides. It's probably expecting you to take a look at the example. Yeah, there we go. So, with many of these modules, there's been a zip file of example code that you can take a look through. In this particular case, this is probably where you want to be copying this from rather than the slides. Although I did from the slides for teaching purposes. So, as I suspected, localhost, the same way that we connect to localhost through when we want to access the web server from the browser, we want to provide localhost to PHP to connect to the database. Localhost. Now, if your server for your database was not on the same physical machine as the web server, this is where you would specify the IP address of the server you want to connect to. Make sense? You guys have done networking, you know all about IP addresses, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, that's where you would put the IP address of the server that you wanted to connect to. For my purposes, as a pure programmer, I can just say wibbly wobbly, networky, wetworky, who cares, I don't care. You guys care about that, I know. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, I call someone. So, let's see if we can connect to this database. In our browsers, let's access the PHP script. Localhost / 2025-03-03. There we go. This is the directory on the web server with the PHP script we just wrote, and click, connected successfully. So, I would like to take a moment to pause for all of you to get connected successfully to appear on your screen, as there's really not much we can do if we're not at least that far. Okay, so please get this down, copy this up, copy this in, get connected to the server. XINF, htdocs. Make a folder and put it in there, 2025-0303. htdocs. For the PHP file. And then I'll make a new folder. Click. You in. htdocs. And make a new folder for it.
Do I tell you this?
You'll need to put it into, so if you go to Explorer, htdocs, new folder. We're putting it on the web folder, or the web server. Choose the name. Sure. Oh. Open with, yeah, if you're feeling adventurous, Notepad. Otherwise, open up the folder. You got it working? Click. Uh-oh. Let me, show me the file. Yeah, show me the source.
Use the source.
Yeah. Like localhost. Also, whatever you name your database, you should put that in database. Is that what you call it? Well, you should check in my PHP file. Go to your web browser. Here. No, you called it fact.
Oh, fact.
Yeah. Go to your web browser. New tab. Oh, yeah, actually, no, I'm sorry. That one, refresh. So, the inspector, you can see that gets output in the say don't use it. Use Notepad++. That Notepad will do this operation. I would delete the hello.
Thank you.
Nope. Did you get connected? Did you get connected? Yes. So your port number is probably going to using your port number with your file. Yeah, folder. So it's :port number / and then the file, the folder. This is going to delete the files. Well, the PHP script has to be turned this way. Where did you put? Where is it? Oh yeah. Oh yes. Oh yes. That's what you did. There you go. See? General, please. Well. Well, here's some issues. So that should be. Nope. Look. And we're waiting for you. Database name, what did you name it? Let's take a look. Yeah, you can also take this, plunk that in there. All right. Yep, let's try that now. Save. Refresh. Maybe it didn't save. No, you need to, no one gets left behind. Oh! That'll do it. There we go. See, that didn't take too long. All right, good. So now that everybody is connected to the database, we may continue and send some queries. So let's try to get the most basic of all basic operations operational, the select query. So the way that the PDO object works, you prepare statements, then you execute statements providing the information the statement needs. Select star from table is a relatively easy one because it doesn't require any additional information. For example, if we were doing an insert operation, that would require some additional information. For example, if we were registering a new user, we would need a username and password from that user in order to register it. But to view the contents of the database, we really don't need anything. So, let's go. Statement is equal to connection, arrow, prepare. We then provide the SQL query. Now the SQL query is provided here in the same exact manner that we were providing the SQL queries from PHP-MyAdmin. They are the same strings to the extent where we can take an SQL query from here. We don't need a where clause. We can take this, copy it, paste it in here, and that will execute that query. Now obviously, if this is one of these cases where you used a template and modified information, like you modified the query, you have to do the modified query, but this is how you do it. Let's just throw a semicolon in there for safety. There we go. Now, we execute the statement. Statement, arrow, execute. Now, this method has a return value. The return value is whether or not this statement succeeded or failed. We can assign that to a variable. Then, we can use an if statement to do something if we succeeded and something else if we failed. If success, do stuff, else, chastise, user. So, does this make sense? Hopefully. For the time being, let's test things just that far. Refreshing the page, we can see that the query has succeeded. However, if I perform some kind of egregious spelling error, such as select wizards from video games, you can see that the query fails. The reason for the query failing in this case would be the field wizards does not exist in table video games. So let's turn it back. So, we have established a connection to the database. we have sent an SQL query to the database requesting information, and we have received a response back. That response was successful, and therefore contains the data the database sent us. All that remains is to view it. Data is equal to statement, arrow, fetch all, PDO, : fetch sock. Again, I'm not expecting you to memorize this, I'm expecting you to write it down. Slash, I'm gonna be putting the code up at the end of class as I always do. Right? So, the question, of course, is, let me just throw a break statement, a couple of break statements in this, just for neatness. I know I said you're not supposed to use breaks, but so query succeeded. We want to view the data. The easiest thing to do is to collect the data and echo it as JSON encode it and then echo it so that we see it in the page. Echo JSON encode data. All right, shall we see if it works? Drum roll, please. Ta-da! And isn't that all of that lovely data which we got from our database? There you go. Isn't that wonderful? Any questions? So, notice the manner in which this data is being presented. We have on the outermost braces of this clump of data, what kind of braces are those? What do they indicate? Yeah, this square brace to that square brace. What do square braces mean in PHP? Yes, but yeah, it's an array. In C# they use curly braces for the same thing, right? Some languages use square braces, some use curly braces. JavaScript also uses square braces because curly braces are reserved for objects. So here we can see each of our records has been collected into one element in an array or a list. Technically they're lists, but I'm not expecting you to know the difference between arrays and lists until you take data structures and algorithms. So that's good. Within each entry, you'll see that we have associative arrays. So if I wanted to know, for example, echo break, echo, if I wanted to know what the value of the name was of the 6th entry, I could say data entry 6 field name. Oh, undefined index. Let's see. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. 5. I don't have 6. That's the problem. Let's say 3. There we go. If I wanted the name of the third element, or the third entry, 0, 1, 2, 3, name, space Harrier. Space Harrier appears. Does that make sense? Good. So, we're getting kind of close to the middle of class, aren't we? This might be a good point at which to break for lunch. Have our traditional half-hour break in the middle of this 4-hour period. Okay? All right. So if everybody could please return to class by 2:28, we shall resume at that time. Okay? Good. Boop. All right. So I'm going to assume at this point that if I've shown you how a select query works, you can figure out how delete queries work. So it is important to understand what the purpose of the server is, right? The server doesn't really originate data, right? The data that's in the database, that all comes from users, right? The server, in its perfect iteration, is a conduit from the user, the data the user provides, to the database. All it should really be doing is filtering out attacks, right? And doing whatever other kinds of filtering are necessary, right? So we need to write databases, or we need to write our server code in such a manner that we can take inputs from the end user, pull them into a database, and then have that shown and updated in output. So so when we're doing this type of thing, the easiest way to approach it is to use HTML forms. Popping back into HTML for a moment. So let's take a look at our PHP code. Let's hop up to the top. Remember that you can mix and match PHP and HTML together in the same document, so long as all of the PHP is inside of PHP tags, we're good. When you're inside of this, inside the question marks, it's PHP mode. When you're outside of the question marks, that's HTML mode. So let's throw in a nice little HTML form. Form. And form. Let's make this form, the purpose of it, add a video game to the database. So, in order to design the form, we need an input in the form for every element, for every piece of data that gets fed into a record. So, in our database, how many and what pieces of data are necessary? Let's take a look at our table. If we were to make a new entry, what would we need to provide? What? Name? Rating. Very good. I noticed you left out ID. Why? because we set that up to auto-increment, right? We don't have to provide this. It's taking care of ID all on its own. So, we need 3 input fields plus a submit button. Input type is equal to text. Name is equal to name, sure. Input type is equal to number or numeric. Name is equal to rating. Rating. Type that would help. Input type is equal to text. Name is equal to genre. Input type is equal to submit. Value is equal to add. Make sense? So, with this form, as with all HTML forms, clicking on the submit button will generate an HTTP request packet, which is sent to the resource specified by the action attribute. There we go. There we go. All right. Now that I've made a little room on my memory card. So, where was I? Ah, yes. So the action attribute of the form specifies what resource we are sending the request packet to. In this case, it's going to be the same resource that made the form in the first place. Action databases.php. If you named your file something other than databases.php, please insert that name as you wrote it. Oh, let me flip my thing around. There we go. So, the next thing that we want to do is to insert some break tabs just to make it some line breaks here just to make it a bit more pleasant to look at. There we go. And now, let's save it and see how it renders in the browser. Add a video game to the database. Now, from a user interface perspective, it is somewhat difficult here to determine what each of these fields actually requires. So I'm just going to quickly, this is not the proper way of doing it, but this is the quick way of doing it. Name, rating, and genre. Insert, there, they appear here. Very good. So, let's see what happens if we fill out the form and click submit. Name, factorial. Rating, I'd give it a 12 out of 10. Genre, factorial. It's its own genre. Oop. Interesting. Is the server running? Did I misspell it? I think I misspelled it. Let's see here. Databases, yes I did. Plural. There we go. And that is basically true about its genre, by the way. Like Dwarf Fortress, it basically invented the genre in which it resides. So, you'll notice in our query parameters, we get all of our lovely data, but you'll see we have nothing with respect to adding it to the database. which of course we don't. We haven't put that in yet. So, anytime we take any information from the user whatsoever, we must filter that data. So, let's take name, filter, input underscore get. Notice that we haven't specified whether this form generates a get or post response, or a get or post request. In such cases, get is the default value. So we could say method get, but that's technically redundant as it's the default value. Method is equal to get. So we want to filter input get name. This is a string. Does anybody remember what filter we use for strings?
In HTML or PHP?
In PHP, if we're reading a string in as an input, there's a specific filter that we use for it. It starts with the word filter. Filter underscore and sanitize is correct. Sanitize what? Don't say string, it's deprecated. Special chars, that's right. Filter, sanitize, special chars. Remember we did that whole demonstration where I showed you that filter, sanitize, special chars changes the script tag from executing into having characters that merely print as if they are the characters themselves and not executing as HTML code. You guys remember that? Remember that? We did that. That was the thing we did. Rating is filter input underscore get rating. This is an integer, so that one will be filter validate int genre filter input get genre, and then we want to filter sanitize special chars again. Now I want to point out the names of the variables here only accidentally correspond to the names given in the form itself. I could choose any variable names I wish. These are not the same things, right? I could make this N, R, and G if I wanted to. They are different and independent variables. However, by the process of filtering the input, I am creating in this the correspondence between this value and that value. It's not inherent, I am creating it. Okay? So, the next thing we need to do is to handle the return result of filter input in each of these cases. I'm going to collect up a big if statement. Something went wrong. Or am I? Filtering worked. Yeah, I think we can do it this way. So, it is not the case that is strictly equal to no, and name is strictly equal, no, that should be an or. Name should not be null, nor should it be false. Rating should not be null, nor should it be false. Notice I'm using strict equality. Genre should not be null, and it should not be false. Insert into database. So, in order to insert this information into the database, the connection to the database needs to have been established first. We therefore, at the moment, have some of our code in the wrong order. I need to either take the connection code and copy it up here before I start doing the filtering, or I need to take the filtering and copy it down here after the connection is established. I'm going to choose to do the former. So we first establish the database. If we can't establish a connection to the database, then it really doesn't make sense to do anything else. So within the catch clause, we can use exit 0 to immediately terminate the program. We can't, this website is based on showing us the contents of the table and being able to put stuff into the table. Without a database connection, we can't do either of them, so we should just show an error message and stop, right? So, we now need to write the code which performs the insert operation. We are prepared to write some SQL. Let's create a statement object. Let's call this, calling it statement will be fine actually. Although we are reusing the variable name, as long as we're finished with the variable before it gets reinstantiated and reassigned, we don't have to worry about any conflicts. However, perhaps just for cleanliness, let's make this statement 2, even though technically it comes before the other one. Connection, prepare, and SQL query. Now, this is where things become important. I'm going to hold up the red pen of doom, and I'm going to say, the following statements are extremely important for internet security. Please pay attention to what I'm about to say. There is a right and a wrong way of doing this. All right? I'll show you the wrong way first. You might say to yourself, well, I want to insert information into this query. I'll grab my prototype, I'll grab my template, throw that in. I don't need to assign to ID, and I don't need all of these values. Here we go. But I want to provide the values of variables name, rating, and genre. So I will simply plunk that in. Name, rating, genre. Well, I just destroyed the database. In the same way that an attacker tries to sneak script tags during an XSS attack, during an SQL injection attack, the attacker will try to sneak SQL code in. So, it doesn't have to be all that complicated. All you have to do is, let's say if we took the value of the genre variable and we assigned to that close brace, semicolon, which indicates a new statement, drop, table, video games, dash dash, which is your comment character. That destroys the database under this circumstance. All the user has to do is enter that, and it destroys our database. This is called an SQL injection attack. This is a destructive form of it, but it doesn't have to be this. It can also be copying the data somewhere else. So, the way to not do this, the PDO object provides us a way of not doing that, not being vulnerable to that. The execute method scans for stuff like that. It scans for special characters, and it rejects stuff that has the form of an SQL injection attack. We merely need to use it correctly. So, instead of splicing our variables directly into the string, pardon me, we instead leave 3 question marks. Everywhere we want to insert data into the string, we leave a question mark. All right? This is very, very, very highly important. All right? This is specifically the thing I'm going to take marks off on assignments for. All right? Then, when you execute the statement, success is equal to statement arrow execute, you provide a list of the things to fill those question marks in with. You provide name, comma, rating, comma, genre. Now you have to be a little bit, you have to be careful about the order. It will fill these slots in with these values in the order you give them, right? Name, name, rating, rating, genre, genre. If there's a mismatch between the ordering here and the ordering here, you will be assigning the wrong values to the wrong fields. You'll get names in your genres and genres in your names. Make sense? As with everything to do with computing, we must express ourselves precisely. So, save. Very good, very good. Now, with an insert operation, we are not expecting any data to be returned to us. All we want is a success or failure message. Data inserted successfully or data not inserted successfully. So if success echo data inserted successfully, else echo data inserted unsuccessfully. line 36, I have the syntax error, right? Oh, yeah. I renamed it to same thing too. All right, let's run this, see if it works. So, you can see that. Our query, although I didn't enter the information here, by refreshing the page, I refreshed sending that query. You can see that the game with identifier 0 is now factorial. Make sense? So we can execute PHP statements from within, strike that, reverse it. We can execute SQL statements by sending them to the server from PHP. We can collect information from the user to send to the server to send to the database. It's a two-step process. Does that make sense? So everything worked. Very good. Really? No questions? All right. So, once again, I'm going to upload this code that I was working on today. But I think that's everything I have to say on the subject of databases today. We can move on to our test review. Good. All right. See, and we still have an hour for it. So, or 50 minutes anyway. Okay. Let me just get this uploaded before I forget. Suppose I should put the database file in there too, right?
I can see there's a practice for the midterm, but it's closed. I'm never gonna open it.
Oh, it's closed? Oh, I'll open it then. Just give me a moment. Yes. Okay. Assignments. Practice midterm closed. Let's open her up, shall we? There we go. And you might as well have as many attempts as you like. Yeah. Let's see, are there shuffle answers? Allow multiple attempts. Allowed attempts. Oh, I can't see anybody trying it more than 1,000 times, eh? Quiz attempts are limited to 3 digits. I can't see anybody trying it more than 999 times. There we go. Save. There we go. Now, please understand that this is for the purpose of studying. The practice midterm is useful to you insofar as you attempt to simulate testing conditions, right? So I wouldn't try it now. This is what I would do, all right? Similarly to last semester, you are being permitted a crib sheet, right? Yep, one cheat sheet, one 8.5 by 11 sheet. You're permitted to use both sides. So this is what I would do, All right, if I were in your position, make your crib sheet, make it yourself, all right? Use that crib sheet on the practice midterm, see how good it is, and make any modifications you think you may need based on the feedback you receive from writing the practice midterm, all right? While you are like obviously the practice midterm is being invigilated, you should, restrict yourself to only those aids that you will be allowed on the real midterm, right? Please don't do what what I've seen with the practice midterm in the past, which is, just a bunch of like ChatGPT generated answers put into the question box. It's like, because you're not going to be able to do that on the midterm. The midterm is a pen and paper midterm, by the way.
I saw in your email you said we were allowed to have calculators, but we didn't do any calculations in any of the assignments.
I know.
Tests.
People always ask me if they can have a calculator, and I'm like I have no particular objection to calculators, in the same sort of sense that I have no objection to people bringing emotional support rabbits. Your calculator can be like a comfort object.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I'm okay, I've got my calculator. It's like, yeah, you can have your calculator. It won't do you any good, but you can have it, right? Yeah, so, any other questions about the midterm?
So the cheat sheet can be this size, or?
Yep, like a standard A4 piece of paper.
What size?
Yep. Just don't bring me don't do it on Bristol board, eh? Also, it's important that your cheat sheet be a summary, right? It's important, there are certain key things that you should write down. When I've said stuff like, I don't expect you to memorize this, I'm not going to expect you to have that for the test, right? Even if you have a cheat sheet. For example, the particulars of the database connection code, this guy, I'm not going to expect you to reproduce that verbatim on the test. That's basically just a test of whether you put that on your cheat sheet or not, right? That's not really doing very much to test your understanding of the material, right? So, it'll track a lot closer to math problems, right? But if you do the practice midterm, you'll have a pretty good understanding of the scope and breadth of the questions on the actual midterm. Okay? The practice midterm is a good practice midterm. It's not like an old copy of the midterm from 6 or 7 years ago by a prof who's not me. That's the program isn't even old enough for that, So, any other questions about the midterm itself? Again, the midterm and the exam from when you had me last semester should set your expectations for format, layout, that type of thing. You'll be like, oh, another one of these. Although the subject will be different. So, shall we begin reviewing actual topics? Okay. I realize that this is a course with a lot of topics. So, there's so much in this course, sometimes I forget what's in this course. Blah. That's not true. So, topics. What do you want me to go over?
Can we start by JavaScript because HTML and CSS easy?
Okay, HTML and CSS is easy, so let's start with JavaScript. That's a great idea. Any objections? Okay. That's still a pretty broad category. What of JavaScript would you like me to go through for you? Because, like, at the moment, you've specified like about 3 weeks worth of material. So, is there anything? Can we drill down on that a little bit further?
You can get on
I well, you got basic syntax. I'm not sure if we need to go over basic syntax. I will if you guys want me to.
it. And Bootstrap, is it in JavaScript or in PHP?
Bootstrap is CSS actually. Within JavaScript, we've got events and event listeners. I might need to consult the notes on that actually, because I'm also teaching like the other JavaScript course at the moment, and I can't quite remember what level of depth we did on events. They go fairly deep on events in the diploma program. jQuery. Under jQuery, we've got loading it, using it, or using it. And perhaps also asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That is to say, AJAX requests. So what do you think? Anything else? You guys just want to review JavaScript? Okay. So, anything in particular about JavaScript's basic syntax that you'd like me to go over? Or do you want me to just start talking? So, there are a couple of important points to understand about JavaScript as opposed to C#, which is the closest language that you guys have already studied to JavaScript. You guys didn't learn any other programming languages in the first semester, no? Just C#? So, one of the most immediate and obvious differences is that C# has a static rigidly defined type system, whereas JavaScript has a more fluid, dynamic type system. So, where in C# we would define a variable by saying int x is equal to 5, in JavaScript, we don't need the information that this is an integer. What is more useful and interesting in JavaScript is how is this variable being scoped. So, we would use one of a few, we would use let var or const x is equal to 5. All of these have to do with scoping rules. So, one of these scopes a variable locally, the other scopes it globally. Can anybody guess which one is which? The reason I ask you questions in class is because the act of retrieving from your brain is actually essential to the learning process. That's why I ask you guys. So even if the answer you say in class is wrong, it's still useful to try to produce it. Yes?
It's the and or what's the local concept is local?
So you say this is local, this is global?
Yes, the top two are local, the bottom one is
Local, global? You are correct that this is local. Local. This one is global, but it's also read-only. Const stands for constant, right? So when you declare a variable a constant, it means that you can't modify it after its creation, right? The use of constants is actually strongly encouraged, according to modern coding standards, over the use of variables, because global variables can be very tricky and introduce lots and lots of difficult to diagnose bugs. So the use of constants over variables reduces the amount of values that that variable can have down to one value, which reduces the amount of errors that you can experience. So const is actually kind of the recommended one to use these days if you can't avoid using global information in one form or another. Var binds globally. Global. There we go. And if you have a variable that's just used without being declared, the word var is implicit there. That's also JavaScript semantics. So if you just use a variable without declaring what type of variable it is, that defaults to a global variable, which is another one of the reasons that JavaScript is terrible. So, does that make sense? Declaring variables. Another important element of JavaScript semantics. In C#, when we declare a variable and we declare it integer, that variable is integer for the entire duration of the program until the end of time. It cannot be anything else. But in JavaScript, if I declare variable x, assign it the value of 5, I can then later say x is equal to potato, or whatever you want. This is not a syntax error. This is called dynamic typing. Dynamic typing. Sound good? The ability to change a variable's data type on the fly is called dynamic typing. Another important element of JavaScript typing is weak typing. So weak typing has mostly to do with the weak equality operator. So remember that in JavaScript we have both double equals and triple equals. Under weak equality, JavaScript will attempt to equate things that are of different data types. So in this case, we have the integer 5 and we have the string 5. Under weak equality, those two things are equal to each other. This can be a convenient time saver, as it saves us the unnecessary burden of converting things to the right data type before we perform comparisons. However, the semantics can be very loose. I have demonstrated in class a number of times that the nature of weak typing in JavaScript results in violation of basic laws of logic, such as the transitive property. Basically, under weak equality, empty string equates to 0, 0 equates to a string containing 0, but these things are not weakly equal to each other. Therefore, we have violated logic. So, the closest comparison to the equality operator that you know in C# is that one. Strong equality in JavaScript respects type. If two things are of a different type, that is sufficient reason for them to not be equal to each other. Does that make sense? Good. So this is weak typing. Make sense? So, from a syntactic point of view, from a semantic point of view, these are some of the main differences between JavaScript and C#. Another difference between C# and JavaScript is the absence of classes. So C#, everything is in a class. Even when it's a C# console app, quote unquote, there's still a class wrapping that, right? Everything is in a class in C#. It is a statically typed, strongly object-oriented language. JavaScript is an interpreted language, and it doesn't have classes, although it has objects. The way that it creates objects is it starts every object as being initially empty, and it adds properties to objects on the fly, because this, again, is an interpreted language. Does that make sense? I'll let you decide which of the two of those you like better. So in terms of our basic expressions, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, concatenation, everything is working pretty much exactly as it does in C#. With respect to Boolean operations, everything is working pretty much exactly as it does in C#. And with respect to control structures, if statements are the same, switches are the same, while and do-while loops are the same, and for loops are the same. But JavaScript does not support for each loops as a native control structure. The way that it does for each loops is as a method attached to aggregate data types, like lists. So to do a for each loop, you have to say list.forEach and then provide an expression. There's no for int I in list. It doesn't exist. So that's okay. Anything you do with a for each loop, you can do with a for loop anyways, so it's not a great loss. You lose some compactness, but my advice to you is to they're just kind of best avoided, the for each loops. Especially because we didn't get very heavily into anonymous functions and all of that jazz. And calculus. So, good. Let's see, is there anything else I want to say about basic syntax, basic language rules? Any questions occur to anybody while I was speaking all of that? No? Okay. So, you want to picture this, or can I erase it? You got it? Anybody want a picture? Okay, all right. So let's talk about events. Oh, wait, before I do, let me see here. Just so that everything's on camera. There we go. Maybe I can even zoom in on the board a little bit too. Let's see here. There we go. All right. All right. Board 1. Board 2. Board 3. There we go. All right. All right. So, events. This kind of hooks into HTML material to an extent. So, in JavaScript, the point of JavaScript is to take a static HTML page and add dynamic behavior to it. That dynamic behavior, much of the time, will be behavior in response to things the user does. Right? Things like clicking, hovering, click and drag, double click, right click, gestures, all of that stuff, right? In JavaScript, we tend towards event-based programming rather than the model of programming that we saw in C#, which is more of an imperative programming mode. So in C#, right? Think about C# console apps, right? we have a series of instructions. When we execute the program, those instructions are executed in sequence immediately, right? Compare that to the events that we were writing in Windows Forms, right? User clicks button, activates code. JavaScript is much more in the user clicks button, activates code mind frame, mind space. So, the way that it works, in JavaScript, we write a function, and then in HTML, we hook an HTML element up to that function, right? There are different fancier ways of doing this, but I believe that is how we were doing it. I think we did maybe hooking up with jQuery as well, but let's focus on like doing it straight from HTML for the time being. So let's say that in HTML we have a button that says click me and button. And let's say in JavaScript we want to do something simple like output to message to console when the button is clicked, right? Very simple. In JavaScript, we must define a function so that we can use that function name in the HTML. So we could say function go takes no arguments. Console dot-log hi. Something like that. Make sense? So far so good? So, the way that we hook this up so that go is called when the button is clicked, we use the onClick attribute. OnClick is equal to go. This sets the HTML element up so that when we click on it, it runs this JavaScript function. Does that make sense? It's actually a little bit less, I think it's a little bit less annoying than C#, this approach to it. It's a little more clean and compact. Make sense? So far so good? Okay. So, in this, onClick is the event, go is the event listener. An event listener is a function that listens for an event to happen, and when it does, it executes it. Okay? Sound good? Any questions? Board 1, board 2, board 3. Is this? There, that's better. Okay. There we go. All right. So, jQuery. So, what is jQuery? Anybody? jQuery is a front-end framework. Bootstrap is also a front-end framework. Framework is the fancy word they're using these days for library. We used to call these libraries, but that didn't sound, I don't know, I guess that sounds too bookish, and now they call them frameworks. So, jQuery is a front-end framework. This means that jQuery is a piece of code that you have to go out onto the internet, grab a copy of, pull it in, copy it into your local file system, and import it in your web page. Pardon me. So, jQuery has a slightly more compact notation for performing work on the web page. So, okay, subtopic, the document object model. Right? So, when we write a web page, the web page is composed of a hierarchical structure of tags, right? So, at the top level, we have the HTML tag, right? Technically, there's one above that called document, and if it's standards compliant HTML, it will also have a doc type tag at the same level as the HTML tag. This forms a classic tree structure. You'll learn, for more on trees, take data structures and algorithms. So, we normally divide the HTML element into the head and the body. What is the purpose of the head? Anybody? I see a lot of people whispering to themselves. Anybody care to actually say what they think, what's on their mind? Two things, all right? Number one, website metadata, right? Information about the website that's not website content, right? For example, what language is this website? What viewport sizes is this website designed for? What character encoding does this website use? This isn't at all information that we've really been playing with in class. It's mostly information that's contained inside of the Emmet abbreviation that you can use to generate the website in VS Code. You know, you hit exclamation mark tab and you get all of that stuff. All of that stuff mostly is metadata. So we've got metadata, we have two other things. Imports. So we import JavaScript and we import CSS. The way that we import CSS is using links, right? Link rel style sheet, right? And the way we import JavaScript is with the script tag. Right? Make sense? The body contains all of those HTML elements that we think of as being the actual web page, right? Things like headings, things like divs, things like forms, things like inputs, things like paragraphs, etc. Right? So, if we take all of the elements of the HTML page and we collect them all up into this tree structure, this is called the document object model. The purpose of the document object model is to provide a programming interface that JavaScript can use in order to make modifications to the DOM. So each one of these nodes in the tree has properties. These properties can be read from and written to by JavaScript. One of the most important properties is inner HTML. This is the content of the tag in raw text. Normally, if you're doing things properly, you won't be modifying the raw string text inside the tags very much. There are other ways of doing that that are more reliable, but kind of at our level, inner HTML is the way that we make a hello world statement work and show up on the screen, right? If I were to say p.innerHTML, p.innerHTML is equal to hello, the contents of the paragraph would be overwritten with the string hello. That's all that would appear there. That makes sense? But the question is, you can't just do this, right? You can't just, magic up a reference to an element in the DOM. For one thing, think about your average Wikipedia page and how many paragraphs it has. How do you know which paragraph you are modifying, right? Well, the answer comes in jQuery by way of CSS. So in CSS, we write selectors, right? The selector is the mechanism by which CSS selects elements out of the DOM to apply style rules to, right? So if I have a CSS, rule like p color green, it finds every element matching this selector and applies color green to it. We can also grab elements using IDs. Strings grabbing IDs have the hashtag octothorpe, #, number sign, whatever you want to call it, as the first character. You can also attack things using classes. Classes, so the difference between an ID and a class, IDs must be unique, but classes are not necessarily unique. So if you apply a class to an HTML element, this is a good way to for example, apply a styling rule specifically to multiple things. Whereas if you are going by ID, you're saying, I want just that one thing to be styled in this manner. Make sense? So jQuery borrows this syntax, or these semantics. In jQuery, the way that we obtain object references, using the $, and then providing the string. The string, for example, P. This will now perform an operation on all paragraph elements. We can no longer use native JavaScript or vanilla JavaScript properties in order to modify things. We have to take these and find their jQuery equivalents. So it's no longer called inner HTML, it's called .html. And there are many of these. .html, .text is another one. The difference between HTML and text is that HTML is allowed to have additional HTML tags in it, but text is not. It's just text, right? I'm gonna, for the benefits of our viewers at home, there you go. Zoom, there you go. There you go. So, does that make sense? So that's like the essential structure of how jQuery works, right? And that's also the reason that it's called jQuery. That's where the name derives. Because these are called CSS query strings, or we often call them selectors, but they're also called queries, right? This is a JavaScript query, therefore a jQuery. Make sense? Good. Yeah, so that's the essential, that's kind of the essential thrust of it. That's the structure of it. There are other things you can do with it as well. Give me just one moment, please, so I can look up the syntax so I'm not lying to you. Yeah. So you remember how we were able to bind a function to an HTML element on the HTML side using onClick, right? Remember? We did that not that long ago. Well, it is also possible to do the same thing using jQuery from the JavaScript side. So, for example, if I wanted to say, that marker is starting to go in it. Let me try this one. Let's say I am targeting all divs in class clickable, right? Let's say I have a function foo, which has been defined, although I'm not particular about what it's been defined with. If I say .click and then specify the function name, this binds the function to everything matching this query as the click event. It sets up an event listener. Does that make sense? So there is a very important pitfall here, though. You have to understand when you are dealing with a function as a reference to a function, and when you are dealing with the function as I want to call this function, right? So if you provide foo with an opening and closing brace, this means call the function. That is an instruction to call the function, right? If you call the function, it's no longer a function. It's the return value of the function, right? So, if you put the round braces in here, this will not work. You must leave them out. If you have a function name without the braces, this makes it a function reference. A function reference. So, anytime we're trying to bind a function to anything, we want to deal with that function as a function. That means not including the round braces and dealing with it as a function reference rather than immediately calling the function. So in this case, if you did have the braces, it would the program, the JavaScript would scan this, say, oh, this has to be executed first. It executes it, takes the return value, plonks it in there. Let's say the return value is like 10, right? It rubs this out, replaces it with 10, and then this thing's like, 10 isn't a function? What are you talking about? And then it probably craps out on you. Or maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. This is JavaScript. Maybe it tries to do it anyway. Who knows? Because JavaScript is just that kind of language. So, any questions about that? Board 1, board 2, board 3. There we go. So, well, looks like there's 1 minute left in class, so I think we're going to have to save the rest of the review for tomorrow. Thank you very much for your time and attention today, folks, and I will see you tomorrow.